They say music can set the soul free. But for Louise Sawyer, music became the bars of her prison. She was a violin prodigy, a woman who could create perfect beauty with 4 strings, but couldn't silence the deafening noise of her debts. With her heart heavy from her father's illness and her life falling apart, she escapes to the one place that promises a moment of oblivion, an elite bar, a world of shadows and whispers that is not her own. It's an act of desperation, a single night to escape the weight of being herself. But in the darkness, a gaze finds her. And it belongs to a king in his castle of glass and steel, watching the city from above. He is Marco Bellini, a man carved from power and silence, a philanthropist to the world, a predator in the shadows where no one dares to look. He doesn't approach her with a threat. He approaches her with an understanding that unnerves her, with a gaze that sees every crack in her soul, and with a stillness that contradicts the danger surrounding him. Their connection is no chance encounter. It's an evaluation. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was looking for a way out. Instead, she found a captor. This is the story of a woman whose music was her only sanctuary, until a man decided that the music and the musician belonged to him. It is a tale of how the most beautiful gifts can be the heaviest chains, and how a man who owns everything can become obsessed with the one thing he cannot simply buy, a woman's soul. So, hold your breath, and let the first note pull you into our story. Comment with a key emoji if you believe that sometimes safety can be the most dangerous prison, and subscribe for more tales of dangerous men and the women who dare to enter their worlds. Get ready for a story that proves that sometimes the only way to save your life is to give it away. It's a story about a broken violinist and the man who made her his golden prisoner. The final note hung in the air of the rehearsal room, a perfect, shimmering thread of sound. It was pure, beautiful, and utterly hollow. Louise Sawyer lowered her violin, the polished wood of the Stradivarius copy feeling cold and foreign against her cheek. Her fingers ached, the tips calloused and numb, but the pain in her chest was a far heavier burden. The music, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its bars forged from expectation and failure. On the small table beside her music stand, a letter lay open. Its sharp, corporate letterhead seemed to mock the elegant curves of the sheet music. It was the 3rd one that month. Final notice. The words were stamped in a terrifying red. She didn't need to read the numbers again. They were burned into her memory, a sum so astronomical it felt like fiction. It was the price of her father's slow, quiet wasting away in a hospital bed miles away. It was the weight that was crushing her. A tremor started in her hand, a betrayal from the same fingers that could coax celestial sounds from 4 simple strings. She placed the violin in its velvet-lined case with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic, snapping the latches shut. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the silence of an empty apartment, of unanswered calls from the finance office, of a future she could no longer see. Tonight, she couldn't bear it. She couldn't go back to her small apartment and face the bills. She couldn't rehearse anymore. The pretense of creating beauty felt like a grotesque lie. For the first time in her life, Louise Sawyer, the disciplined, the focused, the prodigy, wanted to run. She wanted to disappear. She found herself in a part of Argent City she never frequented. Here, the buildings were titans of old stone, their windows glowing with the amber light of old money. She pushed through a heavy oak door and stepped into a world of shadows and whispers. The place was called The Embers. The air was thick with the smell of expensive whiskey, old leather, and the faint, sweet scent of secrets. Low instrumental jazz flowed from hidden speakers, a stark contrast to the demanding concertos that governed her life. Men in bespoke suits spoke in hushed tones, their laughter a low rumble. Louise felt a hot flush creep up her neck. Her simple black dress and worn coat felt like the costume of a different class. She was an imposter here, a sparrow that had wandered into a den of lions. She slid onto a bar stool in the farthest corner, ordering a glass of wine she couldn't afford in a voice she barely recognized as her own. She just needed a moment, an hour, a single night where she wasn't Louise Sawyer, the failing daughter, the struggling musician. She was halfway through her glass, the wine doing little to numb the sharp edges of her panic when she felt it. A gaze. It wasn't intrusive or lewd. It was heavy, a physical weight on her skin. She resisted the urge to look, her heart beginning a frantic staccato rhythm against her ribs. But the feeling persisted, a magnetic pull she couldn't ignore. Slowly, she lifted her eyes and swept them across the dimly lit room. And then she found him. He was sitting alone in a deep leather armchair, partially shrouded in shadow. He wasn't watching her with open curiosity, but with a profound, unnerving stillness. He looked to be in his 40s, his dark hair touched with the faintest hint of silver at the temples. His suit was a masterpiece of understated perfection, the dark charcoal fabric fitting his broad shoulders impeccably. There was no flash, no gaudy jewelry. His power wasn't announced. It was simply a fact, an aura that emanated from him like a chill. His face was a study in hard, handsome lines, a strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth that looked as if it had never known a careless smile. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, intelligent, and held a weariness that seemed ancient. And they were fixed entirely on her. He saw her looking. He didn't smile or look away. He simply held her gaze, a silent acknowledgement that a connection had been made. The world seemed to shrink, the ambient noise of the bar fading to a distant hum. Louise felt her breath catch. This was a mistake. She should leave. He was dangerous. The thought was born not of logic, but of pure animal instinct. But she didn't move. She couldn't. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he stood. He moved with a fluid, deliberate grace that was almost predatory. He didn't approach the bar, but walked directly to the empty stool beside her and sat down. The space between them crackled with an energy she could feel in her teeth. "A difficult day," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low baritone, smooth as aged bourbon, with an undercurrent of something rough and unyielding. Louise swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "Is it that obvious?" "Not to them." He gestured vaguely to the rest of the room. "But I know the look of someone carrying the world on their shoulders. They think it makes them stronger. It only makes them tired." His perception was so accurate it felt like an invasion. He saw past the facade she presented to her teachers, to her father on his good days. He saw the cracks. He sees me. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. "And what do you carry?" she asked, her boldness surprising her. A shadow passed over his features, so quick she almost missed it. "A world of my own," he replied, his voice dropping slightly. He signaled the bartender with a flick of his fingers. "The same as what she's having. And a Macallan 25, neat." They didn't exchange names. They didn't talk about their jobs or their families. They talked about the music playing in the bar, about the biting chill of the coming winter, about the feeling of standing on the edge of a great abyss. His questions were sparse but insightful, peeling back her layers with surgical precision. And Louise, who guarded her heart and soul so zealously, found herself answering with a raw honesty she hadn't used in years. She spoke of the pressure, the fear of her passion turning into a chore, the suffocating weight of expectation. She didn't mention the bills or her father. She didn't have to. He seemed to understand the shape of her pain without needing the details. He listened, his dark eyes never leaving her face. He wasn't offering solutions or pity. He was offering something far more potent, his complete, undivided attention. In his presence, she felt the crushing weight on her chest ease, just for a moment. As the bar began to empty, a heavy silence settled between them. The unspoken question hung in the air, thick and potent. This was the precipice. She could thank him for the drink, walk out the door, and return to her life of quiet desperation. Or she could fall. He stood, placing a few $100 bills on the bar without looking at them. He held out his hand to her, palm open. It wasn't a command, but an invitation. Her mind screamed 1,000 warnings. This is madness. You don't know him. This isn't you. But her body moved of its own accord. She was so tired of being the responsible one, the strong one. For once, she didn't want to be strong. She just wanted to surrender. Not to him, but to the moment. To let go of the reins she held so tightly. She placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, his skin warm. The simple touch was an earthquake, sending a jolt of heat straight through her. He led her out into the cold Argent City night. A black sedan, obscenely luxurious, was waiting at the curb, a driver standing silently by the door. The interior smelled of clean, expensive leather. The ride was silent, the tension a living thing between them. He didn't touch her, but she was intensely aware of his presence, of the solidness of his thigh just inches from her own. The car slid into a private underground garage, and they took a private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse apartment. The entire wall was a sheet of glass, revealing a breathtaking panorama of the glittering Argent City skyline. The city lights spread below them like a carpet of fallen stars. It was the view of a king from his castle. He took her coat, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck. A shiver traced its way down her spine. He turned her to face him, his hand settling on her waist. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question she should have asked hours ago. His thumb stroked her hip bone, a gesture that was both gentle and possessive. His dark eyes searched hers, looking for something she couldn't name. "Tonight," he murmured, his voice a low growl that vibrated through her. "I am simply a man who saw something beautiful and refused to let it break." And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, a kiss that didn't ask for permission, because it already knew the answer. It was dark, deep, and demanded the truth she hid behind every perfect note and every forced smile. And Louise didn't just meet it. She unraveled into it. Every barrier of discipline, every wall of responsibility she had built around her heart, simply crumbled to dust. For the first time in years, she felt a single, perfect note of silence in her mind. It was the end of a struggle, a beautiful, reckless, terrifying mistake, and in that moment, she wanted nothing else. He lifted her into his arms effortlessly, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her away from the city of lights, into a shared darkness where words were no longer necessary, and souls could finally speak. Louise woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight warming her eyelids through a vast expanse of glass. For one blissful, suspended moment, she felt nothing but a strange, profound peace, a stillness she hadn't known since childhood. Her body felt heavy, languid, every muscle humming with the memory of the night. The sheets beneath her were impossibly soft, like cool silk against her skin, and the air smelled of him, a clean, masculine scent of sandalwood, and something uniquely his that was both calming and deeply unsettling. Then, memory returned, crashing over her like a cold wave. Her eyes flew open. She was alone. The space beside her in the enormous bed was empty, the sheets cool and undisturbed, as if he had been a phantom. She sat up, clutching the duvet to her chest, her heart beginning a panicked tattoo. The room was a testament to masculine, minimalist luxury. The walls were a deep charcoal gray, the furniture dark wood and polished chrome. There were no photographs, no clutter, no personal touches. It was as beautiful, controlled, and soulless as a high-end hotel suite. It was the lair of a man who gave nothing of himself away. A flush of shame washed over her. What have I done? She, Louise Sawyer, who never took risks, who planned every step of her life with meticulous care, had given herself to a complete stranger. She had allowed a man she didn't know to touch her, to see her at her most vulnerable, in an act of reckless desperation. She should be horrified. She should be disgusted with herself. But as she sat there, bathed in the morning light streaming through the panoramic window, the feeling that rose in her was not disgust. It was an undeniable, terrifying thrill. She remembered the strength in his hands, the possessive heat of his mouth, the low timbre of his voice in the dark. He had unraveled every tight knot of fear and responsibility inside her and replaced it with a raw, trembling release. She had felt seen. And for a woman who had felt invisible for so long, the sensation was as addictive as any drug. Shaking her head, trying to clear the haze of memory, she slipped out of bed. Her feet sank into a dark, plush carpet. Her clothes from the night before were nowhere to be seen. In their place, laid out neatly on a leather armchair, was a simple, elegant black silk robe. Hesitantly, she put it on. The fabric felt decadent against her skin. This was a world she didn't belong to. a world of silent service and effortless luxury. She walked into the main living area. The view that had stunned her last night was even more magnificent in the daylight. Argent City stretched out below her, a kingdom of steel and glass, its morning bustle a silent film from this impossible height. On the marble kitchen island, a single place had been set: a silver carafe of steaming coffee, a small plate of fresh pastries, a single perfect porcelain cup. There was no note. The gesture was both thoughtful and chillingly impersonal. It was not an invitation to stay. It was a provision, an elegant dismissal. She found her clothes in the closet near the entrance. They had been cleaned and pressed, hung on a wooden hanger. Her worn coat looked pathetic next to the row of identical, exquisitely tailored dark suits that lined the rail. She dressed quickly, the familiar fabric of her dress a stark reminder of who she really was. The woman who had been in his bed last night felt like a different person, a stranger she had inhabited for a few hours. As she put on her coat, she braced herself. She would walk out of this place, go back to her life, and pretend this night had never happened. It was a beautiful, dangerous dream, and now it was over. As expected, the private elevator took her down to the silent garage. The same black sedan was waiting, the same driver holding the door open, his expression impassive. He didn't speak a word to her during the drive, his silence a wall of professional discretion. He took her not to the conservatory, not to the bar, but directly to the front of her own crumbling apartment building. He knew where she lived. A chill ran down her spine. Of course he did. A man like that left nothing to chance. Their meeting, the entire night, had it all been orchestrated? The thought made her feel sick. "Thank you," she managed to say as she got out. But the driver just gave a slight nod, eyes fixed forward, and the car pulled away, disappearing into traffic as if it had never been there. The harsh reality of her life hit her the moment she stepped into her apartment. The air was stale, the light was gray, and the silence was no longer peaceful but suffocating. And there, on the small table where she'd left it, was the letter from the hospital. Final notice. The dream was over. The nightmare was right where she'd left it. She sank onto her worn-out sofa, the springs groaning in protest. Her body ached with a profound exhaustion. She had run from her problems for one night, and now they had returned with a vengeance, mocking her momentary escape. Her eyes fell on the letter again, the source of all her misery. She picked it up, intending to rip it to shreds, to destroy the evidence of her failure. But her gaze caught the fine print at the bottom of the letterhead, something she'd never bothered to read before. It was a list of the hospital's board members and major benefactors. Her eyes scanned the names without interest, until they landed on one. Chairman of the board, Mr. Marco Bellini. The name meant nothing to her. A prickle of unease ran through her, a strange premonition she couldn't explain. A coincidence. It had to be. Argent City was a big place. She let the letter fall to the floor and picked up the remote, desperate for a distraction, for any noise to fill the oppressive silence. She turned the television to a local morning news program. And the annual Argent City Symphony Gala was a resounding success last night, raising a record-breaking amount for the city's youth music programs, the cheerful anchor was saying. The evening's guest of honor was the city's most prominent patron of the arts, philanthropist Marco Bellini. The screen cut to footage from the gala, and the breath left Louise's body in a single, painful gasp. Descending a grand staircase, shaking hands with the mayor, was him, the man from the bar, the man from the penthouse, the man whose bed she had just left hours ago. He looked even more formidable on screen, his bespoke tuxedo emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders, his expression one of cool, detached command. The camera zoomed in on his face as he gave a brief, polite smile that didn't reach his dark, weary eyes. The caption at the bottom of the screen appeared, sealing her fate in cold white letters: Marco Bellini, CEO of Bellini Global Holdings. Louise felt the world tilt and spin. Her blood ran cold. The man she had surrendered to, the stranger who had seen the cracks in her soul, wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was the chairman of the hospital that was threatening to destroy her family. He held her father's life and her entire future in the palm of his hand. And a horrifying, sickening realization dawned, stealing the very air from her lungs. Their meeting had not been a coincidence. It had not been a dream. It had been an evaluation. He had been studying her, and she had just passed his test. The world didn't just tilt. It shattered. Louise sank to the cold wood floor of her apartment, her legs refusing to support her. The cheerful anchor's voice on the television became a distorted, meaningless buzz. The only sound she could truly hear was the frantic, panicked drumming of her own blood in her ears. Marco Bellini. The name echoed in the hollow spaces of her mind. It wasn't just a name. It was an institution. A force of nature that held Argent City in its velvet-gloved hand. Philanthropist, patron of the arts, chairman of the board, CEO. The public titles were a beautiful, gleaming facade, and she, in her foolish desperation, had willingly stepped behind it and seen the darkness it was designed to hide. It had been an evaluation. The thought came back, sharper this time, a shard of ice in her stomach. He hadn't seen a woman in a bar. He had seen a vulnerability, an opportunity. Had he known about her father? About the bills? Had he been watching her for weeks, waiting for the precise moment she would be desperate enough, broken enough, to fall into his perfectly laid trap? A wave of nausea hit her. She felt exposed, violated in a way that had nothing to do with the physical intimacy of the night before. He had taken more than her body. He had taken her agency, her free will, and turned it into a weapon against her. The memory of the night, once a thrilling and dangerous secret, was now tainted, twisted into something sordid and ugly. The tenderness she thought she had felt in his touch was just the careful handling of a newly acquired possession. She pulled herself up, driven by a primal urge to do something, to erase the night. She went to the conservatory, the violin case in her hand feeling like a lead weight. She needed the familiar ritual of practice, the comforting structure of scales and arpeggios, to reclaim a piece of herself. She found an empty practice room, the same one as the day before, and took out her instrument. But the moment the bow touched the strings, the sound was all wrong. The note that emerged was thin, weak, trembling with the tremor in her own hand. The music that had once been her escape was now inextricably linked to him. He was a patron of the arts. He sat on the symphony board. He lived and breathed this world, not as an artist, but as a king, surveying his domain. Her sanctuary had been invaded. Every note she played felt like a performance for him, an audition she hadn't known she was giving. Frustration and rage warred with a paralyzing fear. She played for an hour, her movements growing frantic, punishing the strings, trying to force the music to obey her, to sound like hers again. But it was useless. The ghost of his presence was in the room with her, his dark, knowing eyes watching from the shadows. She finally gave up, the screech of a sour note echoing her own inner scream. She returned to her apartment that afternoon feeling defeated, a hollowed-out version of herself, and she found them waiting. Two men, both built like mountains and dressed in the same dark, impeccably tailored suits as the men in his orbit, stood outside her apartment door. They weren't blocking her path, but their presence was a silent, immovable wall. They didn't look at her, their gazes fixed on some distant point down the hall. They were simply there, guardians or jailers. Her heart leaped into her throat. She fumbled for her keys, her fingers suddenly clumsy and useless. One of the men stepped forward, not to threaten her, but to hold out a long, thin box wrapped in simple, elegant black paper. "A delivery for Miss Sawyer," he said, his voice a low, flat monotone, devoid of any emotion. Louise stared at the box, unable to move. I didn't order anything." "It was sent to you," the man replied, his tone making it clear this was not a conversation. He held the box out further. Accepting it was not a choice. Her hands shook as she took the package. It was surprisingly heavy. The two men gave a simultaneous, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and walked away, their footsteps silent on the worn hall carpet. They disappeared down the stairs without a backward glance. Inside her apartment, she locked and bolted the door, her back pressed against the wood as if it could protect her. She stared at the box in her hands. It was from him. It had to be. A gift. A warning. With Marco Bellini, she suspected they were the same thing. With trembling fingers, she tore away the paper. Inside was a long, dark case of polished, time-worn leather. It wasn't a jewelry box. It was a violin case. Her breath hitched. She already had a violin. A very good one. A copy she had saved for years to afford. She placed the case on her sofa and slowly unfastened the tarnished brass latches. They clicked open with a soft, expensive sound. She lifted the lid, and the air left her lungs. Resting on a bed of deep, faded purple velvet was a violin. But it was not just any violin. Louise knew its lines, its color, the delicate, specific curve of its F-holes, the way a master luthier centuries ago had worked the maple of its back into a subtle, shimmering flame. She had only ever seen instruments like this behind glass in museums or in the pages of books. It was an amati, a real one, an instrument worth not just a fortune, but a priceless piece of history, its voice having sung in the greatest concert halls of Europe. It was a musician's holy grail. It was an impossible, extravagant, terrifying gift. Tucked into the silk ribbons holding the bow was a small cream-colored card, folded in half. Her name, Louise, was written on the front in a strong, elegant script. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. The note inside was short, the ink a stark black against the cream. Beauty deserves a voice worthy of it. Do not disappoint its new owner. Its new owner. The words were a deliberate, calculated cruelty. Was he talking about the violin? Or was he talking about her? She felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. This wasn't a gift. It was a claim. A brand. It was the first golden bar of her cage, and it was beautiful. At that moment, her phone buzzed on the table. She flinched, startled by the sudden noise. It was a number she didn't recognize. A private number. With a sense of fatalistic certainty, she knew who it was. She stared at the screen, watching it vibrate, her mind screaming not to answer. Let it ring. Pretend you never got it. But what would happen then? Would the two men reappear at her door? The not knowing was worse than the knowing. With a trembling thumb, she answered the call and brought the phone to her ear, her own breathing loud and ragged. There was silence for a beat. Then, his voice. That same deep, smooth baritone from the bar. A voice that had wrapped around her like a warm blanket just 2 nights ago, now sent a spear of pure ice through her veins. Louise. He said her name not as a greeting, but as a statement of fact. A confirmation of ownership. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up. You received my gift, he continued, a calm certainty in his tone. I trust you found it acceptable. What do you want from me? She finally managed to whisper, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. There was another pause on the other end of the line, a silence so heavy she could feel it. She could picture him in his penthouse, looking out over the city that belonged to him, holding the phone in a relaxed, easy grip while she trembled in her tiny apartment. I want you to get ready, he said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate murmur she remembered so vividly. You will wear the red dress, the one in the back of your closet. I am having you picked up at 7. We are going to the symphony. It was not a question. It was not an invitation. It was a command. And as the line went dead, Louise stared at the priceless violin, a masterpiece of art and history, and understood. She wasn't just being invited to a concert. She was being put on display. The silence that followed the disconnected call was more terrifying than his voice had been. Louise stood frozen in the center of her small living room, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the empty, mocking hiss of the line. The red dress, the one in the back of your closet. How? How could he possibly know about that dress? A cold, crawling fear slithered up her spine. The dress was a ghost. She had bought it 2 years ago for a symphony audition that, in the end, she had been too intimidated to attend. It had been a beautiful, foolish extravagance, a slash of crimson silk in a wardrobe of practical blacks and grays. She had worn it exactly once, for herself in front of the mirror, before pushing it to the back of the closet, a symbol of a courage she did not possess. Had he been watching her that long? Had his people been in her apartment while she was out? The idea was a violation, making the very air around her feel contaminated. Her home, her one safe space, was no longer safe. He hadn't just sized her up in one night. He had studied her, cataloged her, learned her vulnerabilities. She was an insect under his microscope. For one wild, fleeting moment, Defiance surged in her. She would say no. She would lock the door and refuse to answer. And then what? The thought died as quickly as it was born. A man who could send giants in suits to her door, who could gift a museum piece as a casual warning. What would such a man do if he were defied? The final notice letter on her floor was the answer. He wouldn't hurt her, not directly. He didn't have to. He would simply tighten the noose that was already around her father's neck. He would destroy her life with one silent phone call, and she would be utterly powerless to stop it. There was no choice. There had never been one. She moved like an automaton, her limbs feeling disconnected from her mind. She walked to the closet and pushed past the dark, sensible clothes until her fingers brushed against the cool silk. She pulled the dress out. It was stunning, a deep blood red that seemed to drink the gray light of her apartment. It was a dress designed to be seen, a dress for a woman who was confident, fearless, a dress for a woman who was not her. Getting ready felt like a ritual of surrender. Each step, the bath, the makeup she applied with a trembling hand, the act of sliding the silk over her skin was a concession, an admission of his power over her. The dress fit perfectly, clinging to her curves, the color of vibrant rebellion against the paleness of her face. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a stranger, a beautiful, terrified doll, dressed for her owner's pleasure. At precisely 7 o'clock, her intercom buzzed. A single, sharp ring. She didn't have to ask who it was. She took a deep, shuddering breath, grabbed the small, simple clutch that was the only purse she owned, elegant enough for the dress, and walked out of her apartment, leaving the Amati violin in its case on the sofa, like a silent, beautiful threat. The same black sedan was waiting. The same driver held the door. This time, however, the back seat was not empty. Marco Bellini was waiting for her. The interior of the car, which had felt spacious before, now seemed to shrink, charged with his presence. He wore a tuxedo tailored to perfection, the stark black and white making him look even more formidable than he had on television. He didn't say hello. He simply watched her as she slid into the leather seat, his dark eyes raking over her, from the flush in her cheeks to the way the red silk fell over her legs. It was a look of pure, unapologetic assessment, the look of a man admiring his newest, most valuable acquisition. "Red?" he said, his voice a low rumble she felt more than heard in the enclosed space. "I was right. It suits you." The car pulled away from the curb with impossible smoothness. Louise stared straight ahead, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. "How did you know about the dress?" she asked, her voice tight and fragile. He turned his head slightly, the city lights outside flashing over the sharp planes of his face. "It's my business to know things, Louise, especially about the things that are important to me." Important to me. There it was. The truth, stark and plain. She wasn't a thing. She was important. The distinction was subtle, but it terrified her even more. The rest of the drive was silent, a thick, suffocating tension filling the air. She was intensely aware of every small detail, the faint scent of his cologne, the solid warmth of his body just a foot away, the quiet confidence in the way he simply occupied space, as if the world arranged itself around him by default. He is a monster, her mind screamed, but a treacherous part of her, a part she hated, couldn't deny the magnetic pull of his power. They arrived at the Argent City Symphony Hall, a grand old building of marble and gold. The car didn't pull up to the main entrance with the crush of people, but to a discreet side door where a single valet waited. They were escorted inside, through private corridors, bypassing the crowds entirely. They emerged in the grand foyer, and it was like stepping onto a stage. Heads turned, conversations faltered. A subtle ripple went through the opulent crowd as people noted his presence, and then their eyes, filled with curiosity and speculation, slid to her. Louise felt 100 gazes on her like physical blows. The red dress was no longer just a dress. It was a target, a beacon that screamed her connection to the man at her side. Marco seemed oblivious to the attention, but she knew he wasn't. He was orchestrating it. He placed his hand on the small of her back, a light but unmistakably possessive gesture, and guided her through the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. His touch was a brand, a silent declaration to everyone watching. "Mr. Bellini, a pleasure to see you." A portly man with a florid face bustled over, his eyes darting nervously between Marco and Louise. "Councilman," Marco acknowledged with a slight cool nod. His hand tightened fractionally on her back. "A wonderful evening for the symphony." "Indeed, indeed. And this is—" the councilman asked, his gaze lingering on Louise with ill-disguised curiosity. Before Louise could even think of an answer, Marco's voice cut in, smooth as steel. "This is Louise," he said, his tone leaving no room for further questions. He didn't offer her last name. He didn't offer an explanation. He presented her with the simple, absolute finality of a king presenting his chosen consort. He guided her away, leaving the councilman sputtering. They stopped on a gilded balcony overlooking the main staircase, 2 glasses of champagne seeming to appear in his hands from a passing waiter. He handed one to her. Her fingers were so cold the chilled glass felt warm. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice fierce, desperate. "Parading me around like some prize?" He took a slow sip of his champagne, his dark eyes watching her over the rim of the glass. The intensity of his gaze made her feel stripped bare. "In my world," he said softly, his voice for her ears alone amid the din of the crowd, "everything is about perception. Power isn't just about what you can do, but what others believe you can do. They see you with me, and they understand." "Understand what?" she challenged, her voice trembling with an anger she couldn't contain. He set his glass down on the balcony railing and turned to face her fully, cornering her against the cold marble. He raised his hand, and for a terrifying second, she thought he would strike her. Instead, his thumb rose to gently trace the line of her jaw, his touch shockingly soft against her skin. "They understand," he murmured, his gaze holding hers captive, "that the most beautiful thing in this city now belongs to me. They understand that to touch you, to even look at you the wrong way, would be a fatal mistake." He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm not parading you, Louise. I'm protecting you. Welcome to my world." "Welcome to my world." The words echoed in her ears, a pronouncement that was both a threat and a twisted sort of vow. Protection? It felt like the most suffocating kind of ownership. His world wasn't a sanctuary. It was a fortress, and he had just locked the gate with her inside. The chimes rang, a series of soft, melodic notes signaling the start of the performance. The crowd began to drift toward the grand doors of the concert hall. Marco's hand returned to the small of her back, a constant, possessive weight, and he guided her not to the general seating, but up a private velvet-roped staircase. It led to the upper circle, and then to a single secluded box that hung over the auditorium like a king's private viewing chamber. As they settled into the plush velvet chairs, Louise felt a wave of bitter, cutting irony. How many times had she dreamed of this, of sitting here, of being a part of this world of patrons and benefactors? She had imagined earning her place through years of grueling practice, by the sheer force of her talent. Instead, she was here as a decoration, an accessory to a man who had bought her access. The lights in the great hall dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. The orchestra took the stage. The conductor raised his baton, and the first piece began. It was Mozart. Light, elegant, a confection of sound. Louise the musician tried to lose herself in it. She tried to follow the intricate interplay of the strings, but she couldn't. Her awareness was entirely consumed by the man sitting beside her. He didn't shift. He didn't look at a program. He simply sat in the darkness, a figure of absolute stillness, and listened. She could feel the intensity of his focus. He wasn't just hearing the music. He was dissecting it, consuming it. Was this what he had seen in her music? A thing of beauty to be analyzed, understood, and ultimately possessed? She risked a glance at him. In the faint reflected glow from the stage, his profile was sharp and severe. His eyes were fixed on the first violinist, and his expression was one of deep, unreadable concentration. He wasn't just a brute with money. He understood this world. He appreciated the artistry, the discipline, the perfection. And that somehow was even more terrifying. The first half of the concert ended. The lights came up. Marco turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers in the restored light of their private box. "The concertmaster," he stated, his voice a low murmur. "His vibrato is weak in the upper registers. He fears the high notes." The critique was so precise, so technically correct, it stunned her into silence. It was the same observation she had made herself. He wasn't just listening. He was judging. You know a lot about music, she said, the words feeling inadequate. A flicker of something. Was it sadness? Regret? Passed through his eyes, so fleeting she thought she'd imagined it. My mother was a cellist, he said. The admission was unexpected, a tiny crack in his marble facade. She believed music was the only civilized thing in a world of savages. He paused, his gaze growing distant. She was, of course, wrong. There is nothing civilized about it. It is passion, and rage, and heartbreak, given a voice. It is the most savage thing of all. His eyes came back to hers, and the intensity in them made her breath catch. That's what I heard in you, that day you were rehearsing. I heard it from the hallway. You weren't just playing the notes. You were tearing them from your soul. The second half of the program began. The piece was Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, a world away from the polished elegance of Mozart. This was a symphony of fate, a work that was brutal, passionate, and ultimately tragic. From the opening blast of the horns, the fate motif, Louise felt a chill run up her arms. As the music swelled, a tumultuous storm of strings and brass, she felt her own emotions mirrored in the sound. The desperation, the struggle, the brief soaring moments of beauty that were inevitably crushed by the relentless return of that dark, opening theme. It was the story of her life, written in music a century before she was born. Without thinking, a single tear escaped her eye and traced a hot path down her cheek. She quickly, silently, tried to wipe it away, hoping the darkness would hide her moment of weakness. But he saw. She felt his hand cover hers where it rested on the velvet armrest between them. His touch wasn't forceful or demanding. It was firm, warm, and it enveloped her entire hand. His thumb began to move in a slow, hypnotic circle over her knuckles. Was it a gesture of comfort? Of ownership? With him, the two were indistinguishable. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. Trapped in the dark, with the beautiful, tragic music swelling around them, his touch was the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving. She closed her eyes, and for the rest of the symphony, she just listened, her hand captive in his, the tear drying on her cheek. She was his prisoner, yes, but in that moment, he was also the only one who seemed to understand the language of her soul's sorrow. When the final crashing chords of the symphony faded and the audience erupted into applause, they remained seated, his hand still covering hers. Finally, as the house lights came up fully, he released her. The loss of contact felt strangely abrupt, leaving her skin cold. "It's time to go," he said, his voice once again cool and controlled, the moment of shared vulnerability. If that's what it was, gone as if it had never happened. The drive back to her apartment was as silent as the drive there, but the silence had changed. Before, it had been filled with tension and anger. Now, it was filled with a confusing, weighted intimacy. He had seen a piece of her, the part she hid from everyone, the part that only music could touch. The car stopped in front of her building. She expected him to simply let her out. Instead, he got out with her. He walked her to the front door of the building, the streetlight casting their long shadows on the pavement. He took the key from her trembling hand, his fingers brushing hers, and unlocked the door for her. "Tomorrow morning," he said, his voice low. "A car will be here at 9. It will take you to your father's hospital. You will find that his account has been settled. In full. He has also been moved to the finest private suite, with the top specialists assigned to his case." Louise's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What? Why?" He moved closer, backing her against the door, his large body blocking out the rest of the world. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. "Because," he murmured, his voice a dark, silken caress, "I do not allow the things I own to be tainted by worry. Your father is cared for. Your debts are gone. You have the finest instrument ever made. All you need to think about now, Louise," his gaze dropped to her lips, "is me." He didn't kiss her. He simply held her there, captive by his words and his proximity. Then he stepped back, turned, and walked back to the car without another word, leaving her breathless and trembling in the doorway, the golden bars of her cage invisibly but decisively locking into place all around her. The night was a shallow, restless sea. Louise tossed and turned, caught in a fever dream of tragic symphonies and the suffocating scent of sandalwood. When she woke, the pale morning light felt invasive, exposing the truth of the night before. It hadn't been a dream. The Amati violin case still sat on her sofa, a silent, gleaming testament to her new reality. "Your debts are gone." The words had followed her into her sleep, a tempting, poisonous lullaby. Could it be true? A desperate, treacherous hope fluttered inside her. The weight she had carried for so long, the crushing pressure of her father's medical bills, could it really be gone? She dressed mechanically, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and dread. She chose her most nondescript clothes, as if trying to make herself invisible, to shrink back into the person she was before him. It was a futile gesture. At precisely 9 o'clock, the buzz of her intercom was a sharp confirmation. Her new life operated on a schedule he created. Downstairs, it was a different car. Not the imposing sedan, but a discreet, dark gray luxury town car. The driver was new, his face as impassive as the first. He held the door for her, and she slid inside. The ride to the hospital was a journey through a city that no longer felt like her own. The familiar streets looked foreign, clouded by the new, sinister lens through which she saw the world. At the hospital, the change was immediate and jarring. Before, she had navigated crowded public waiting rooms. Today, the driver escorted her to a private wing she never knew existed. A woman at a polished mahogany desk smiled at her approach. "Ms. Sawyer, we've been expecting you," the woman said. "Mr. Bellini arranged everything. Your father is resting comfortably in the St. Ambrose suite." The St. Ambrose suite wasn't a hospital room. It was a luxury hotel room with medical equipment discreetly hidden away. Her father was sleeping in a large, comfortable bed, his breathing even for the first time in months. A new doctor, a man with a kind face, introduced himself as Dr. Finch, the head of pulmonology. "Your father's case is now my personal priority, Ms. Sawyer," he explained. Mr. Bellini made it quite clear that no expense is to be spared. Louise listened, her throat tight. It was everything she had ever prayed for. The best care, the best doctors, no more worry. It was a miracle. And she knew the price. She felt a profound wave of guilt, but beneath it, an undercurrent of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy. She had given herself to a dangerous man, and in return, he had given her her father's life back. She sat by her father's bedside for hours. He woke for a while, more lucid and in less pain. He marveled at the room, assumed it was a hospital grant. Louise just smiled, the secret a hot weight in her chest. How could she ever explain the truth? "I've found a patron, Father. One who asks for more than just my music." At midday, the car returned. She thought, foolishly, that it would take her back to her apartment. Instead, the driver took a different route, toward the glittering towers of the city's wealthiest district. He pulled into the same private underground garage. "Mr. Bellini thought you would be more comfortable here," the driver said, his first and only words to her. "Your belongings have already been brought over." Panic, cold and sharp, seized her, but it was quickly followed by a strange resignation. She no longer had an apartment to go back to. Her father was receiving the best care. She no longer had any debts. He wasn't caging her with chains. He was caging her with relief, with the absence of fear. This time, the elevator opened onto a different floor, into an apartment as grand as his penthouse, but subtly different. Where his was dark and masculine, this space was lighter. The walls were a soft cream, the furniture elegant and comfortable. A beautiful baby grand piano sat in one corner, and dominating the living room, another panoramic window. It was a queen's apartment, in the same castle as the king. Her violin case, her old one, was there. Her music stand, set up by the window. Her clothes hung in a vast walk-in closet, her few worn sweaters looking lost among rows of new items she'd never seen before. Cashmere, silk, designer labels, all in her size. Her entire life had been carefully transplanted into this new, gilded existence. She wandered through the silent, opulent rooms, a ghost in a life that was meant to be hers. In the entryway, A single keycard and a new phone sat next to a framed bank statement. An account had been opened in her name. The balance had so many zeros she could barely comprehend it. It was then that the true nature of their arrangement became clear. He wouldn't have to lock her in. He had simply removed every reason for her to leave. He didn't build the walls of her prison with stone. He built them with comfort, luxury, and the fulfillment of her most desperate prayers. It was a cage woven from her own deepest desires, and that made it the most inescapable prison of all. She walked to the vast window, looking out over the city. She was at the center of the world, and yet she had never felt so completely alone. She was a bird in a beautiful, soundproof glass box, able to see the world, but never touch it again. Later that evening, as twilight painted the sky, she heard the soft chime of the elevator. A moment later, a keycard slid into the lock, and the door to her apartment opened. Marco Bellini stepped inside. He was no longer in a suit, but dressed in dark trousers and a simple gray cashmere sweater that mirrored her own. He looked less like a Don, and more like a man coming home. He stopped when he saw her standing by the window, her silhouette framed against the dying light. "Is it to your liking?" he asked, his voice calm, as if he were a host inquiring after a guest's comfort. "This is not a home," she replied, her voice low and trembling with an anger that felt impotent. "It's a cage." He walked slowly toward her. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes searching her face. "All the most precious things are kept secure, Louise," he said softly. "To protect them from the world. To keep them safe." He took another step. "To keep them for myself." His words hung in the air, a suffocating silk tapestry of possessiveness. To keep them for myself. There was no pretense. He was the collector, and she was his rarest, most valuable specimen. Louise wanted to scream, but a numbness, cold and heavy, was beginning to settle in her bones. What was the point of fighting? Fighting against what? Against relief? Against safety? Rage required energy, and hers was seeping away, replaced by a hollow feeling of inevitability. "What do you want from me?" she asked, the question a tired echo of the one she'd asked on the phone. This time her voice was flat. Marco poured 2 glasses of a deep red wine. He held one out to her. She didn't move to take it. After a moment, he set it on a table near her. "I want you to live," he said, the simplicity of the statement a stark contrast to the complexity of their situation. "I want you to wake up in the morning without the weight of the world on your shoulders. I want you to walk to that window," he gestured with his glass toward her music stand, "and play. Not for an audition, not for a teacher, not for your father's survival. I want you to play for yourself, and I want you to play for me." It was the most perverse, twisted logic she had ever heard. He had freed her from all her worldly concerns only to make himself her sole concern. He was her benefactor and her jailer, her patron and her captor. And so her new life began. The days bled into one another. A housekeeper she never saw came and went like a phantom, leaving behind fresh flowers and gourmet meals. The driver was available at a moment's notice. But where would she go? Her friends from the conservatory belonged to a life that was no longer hers. The only visit she made was to the hospital, to sit with her father, who grew stronger every day, a living symbol of the price of her golden cage. Marco's presence was a constant, even when he wasn't there. He would appear in the evenings, letting himself into her apartment with his own keycard. He rarely demanded anything from her. He would simply be there. He would sit in one of the armchairs drinking wine and watch her. The silence between them was a battleground. Louise refused to speak unless spoken to, treating him with a cool politeness that was its own form of defiance. He never touched her, not since the night at the symphony. He kept a careful distance, as if he knew that forcing a physical intimacy would be to break the delicate spell he was weaving around her. This was a different kind of conquest. It was a siege. He was waiting for her to open the gates. Her one true act of rebellion was the violin, the Amati. It sat in its case, untouched. It was the symbol of her captivity, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of hearing her play it. Instead, she used her old violin. Every day she would practice, her back to the room, facing the vast expanse of the city skyline. She played with a cold, technical precision, pouring all her anger and frustration into the pieces. She knew he was listening. Sometimes he was physically in the room, a silent shadow in the corner. Other times, she just knew, with a chilling certainty, that he could hear her from his own apartment, that the sound of her music traveled through the veins of the building, a direct line from her soul to his. One evening, a week into her captivity, she was in the middle of a particularly fierce Paganini piece when a string on her violin snapped with a sharp, violent crack. Frustration, hot and immediate, brought tears to her eyes. She put the instrument down, her hands shaking. From the armchair behind her, Marco's voice cut through the silence, calm and even. "It is a good instrument, but it cannot handle the passion you are forcing through it. You will break it." Louise spun around to face him. "And what would you know about it?" she retorted, her voice dripping with contempt. He stood and walked toward her. He looked at her old violin. Then his gaze shifted to the closed case of the Amati. "I know that a voice like yours requires an instrument that can withstand its power," he said softly. He gestured to the Amati. "That violin has survived for 300 years. It has survived wars and fires and revolutions. It has been held by geniuses and madmen. It can survive you, Louise." He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His dark eyes locked on hers, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the cool control. She saw a flash of raw, naked hunger. It wasn't just for the music. He wanted to hear her. The wild, untamed part of her soul he had spoken of at the symphony. He wanted her to surrender to the music, because he knew that would be the first step to surrendering to him. The air between them crackled. It was a dare, a test. He was challenging her. Slowly, deliberately, she turned away. She walked to the Amati's case. Her fingers trembled as she unfastened the latches. The violin lay on its velvet bed, its aged wood glowing with a warm, inner light. She lifted it. It felt like an extension of her own body. She nestled it under her chin. She picked up the bow. She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the city lights. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and drew the bow across the strings. The sound that emerged was not the sound of a violin. It was the sound of a human soul crying out in the darkness. It was a note so rich, so deep, so full of pain and beauty and rage, that it seemed to vibrate the very glass of the window. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking sound she had ever produced, and in the silence of the vast apartment, it was the sound of absolute, unconditional surrender. The final resonant note of the Amati faded, leaving a silence in the room that was heavier and deeper than before. A silence filled with the ghost of the sound, with the raw, naked emotion she had just poured into the air. Louise kept her eyes closed, her body trembling with the aftershock of that surrender. The violin felt like a part of her, a conduit through which she had channeled every ounce of her rage, her grief, and her terrifying, unwilling fascination with the man who stood behind her. She had surrendered. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. By playing his violin, by letting its perfect, ancient voice speak for her, she had finally answered his call. She had given him the only thing she had left, the unfiltered truth of her soul. She felt his presence move closer. She didn't need to open her eyes to know he was now directly behind her, so near his shadow covered her. The warmth of his body was a tangible thing, a threat and a promise. She expected him to speak, to claim his victory. Instead, there was only the sound of his quiet breath. Then, she felt the whisper-light touch of his fingers on the nape of her neck, just above the collar of her sweater. His touch wasn't forceful, not even possessive. It was shockingly gentle, a phantom caress that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated heat through her entire body. Her breath caught in her throat, and a violent shiver racked her frame. "There it is," he murmured, his voice a low, rough sound right beside her ear. "That is the sound I have been waiting to hear." His fingers lingered on her skin for another moment, a brand of warmth and belonging, before they withdrew. Louise opened her eyes, her vision blurry. The city lights danced before her. She felt dizzy, disoriented, as if the world had tilted on its axis. When she finally found the strength to turn around, he was walking back toward the bar. He moved with the same deliberate grace, his composure perfectly restored, as if the intensely charged moment had never happened. "From now on," he said, his voice back to its usual cool, even tone. "You will play for me every evening. 1 hour. You may choose the pieces." It was a command, disguised as a choice. And Louise, her body still humming from the music and his touch, knew she would obey. The battle was over. A new, far more dangerous dynamic had just begun. The following days settled into a new routine, defined by this strange, intimate ritual. Every evening he would appear. He would pour a drink, settle into his armchair, and she would play. She chose the most demanding pieces, the most emotionally turbulent she knew. She poured all her confusion and turmoil into the music, using the violin as her only sanctioned form of protest, her only way to speak to him without words. And he would listen. His focus was absolute, a silent, powerful force that seemed to draw the music out of her. He never interrupted. He simply absorbed the sound, his dark eyes watching her, his expression a mask she could not decipher. These nightly concerts became the focal point of her existence, a strange, beautiful, and deeply disturbing form of communion. During these sessions, the air in the apartment grew thick with an unspoken tension. Louise was intensely aware of the way her own body moved as she played, of the passion she knew he was seeing in her posture, in the fierce concentration on her face, and she was more aware of him than she had ever been of another human being. She hated him. She hated him with every fiber of her being. But a dark, insidious part of her was beginning to crave his attention, to need the focus of his silent, appreciative gaze. He was still careful not to touch her. The brief contact on her neck had been a singular event, a promise of what was to come. But the physical distance only seemed to enhance the charge between them. He would walk past her, his arm brushing hers, and she would flinch as if burned. One evening, after a particularly grueling performance of a Brahms sonata, she lowered the violin, feeling utterly drained. "You are lonely," he stated from his chair. It was not a question. Louise flinched at the brutal accuracy of his observation. "I am a prisoner," she corrected, her voice sharp. "Prisoners are often lonely." He ignored her barb. "You should have a companion." The next afternoon, a sleek black car arrived for her. The driver simply said, "Mr. Bellini has arranged an appointment for you." He took her to one of the city's most exclusive animal shelters. A woman was waiting for them. "Ms. Sawyer," she greeted warmly. "Mr. Bellini called ahead. He said you were looking for a quiet friend." Louise was led to a private viewing room. Moments later, a handler brought in a cat. It was a Russian blue, a sleek creature with a shimmering silver-gray coat and striking emerald-green eyes. The cat was cautious. Louise sat on the floor, waiting. After a long moment, the cat moved with a fluid, silent grace and came to her, rubbing its head against her outstretched hand. Its purr a low, vibrating engine. There was a tag on its collar. The name was Shadow. It was, of course, perfect. She took the cat home. Its quiet, undemanding presence was a small, warm light in the vast, empty opulence of the apartment. That night, when Marco arrived, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the cat, now curled asleep in Louise's lap. Shadow opened one green eye, regarded Marco with an air of aristocratic disdain, and went back to sleep. "He seems to have settled in," Marco remarked, with a hint of what might have been amusement in his voice. "He doesn't ask for anything," Louise replied, stroking the cat's soft fur. It was a pointed remark, a small verbal barb aimed at him. Marco walked over to her chair. He didn't look at her, but at the cat. He crouched down, and for a heart-stopping moment, Louise thought he would touch her. Instead, his long, elegant fingers stroked the cat's silver head. Once. Shadow, to Louise's astonishment, didn't flinch but leaned into the touch. "Everything asks for something, Louise," he said softly, his hand still resting on the cat. His gaze lifted and met hers. The warmth of the moment vanished, replaced by the familiar possessive darkness in his eyes. "You would be wise to remember that." His fingers were inches from hers, close enough for her to feel the heat of his skin. The moment hung suspended, a tableau of terrifying domesticity. The man, the woman, the cat between them. A fragile piece, held together by the thinnest of threads. A thread he could snap at any moment. The cat, Shadow, became a silent third party in their strange, captive life. His presence softened the hard edges of Louise's loneliness, giving her something to care for, a warm, living creature that wasn't under Marco's direct control. Or so she thought. In truth, the cat was just another part of the cage, a carefully chosen comfort to make the imprisonment more bearable, more complete. The nightly concerts continued. The tension between them grew, coiling tighter with each passing day. It was a living entity in the apartment, a predator that lurked in the spaces between them. Louise felt it every time he looked at her, a low, constant hum of awareness under her skin. She had begun to anticipate his arrival in the evenings, her body tensing with a feeling that was no longer just fear, but a dark, frightening mix of dread and expectation. One afternoon, her carefully controlled world was unexpectedly breached. Her new phone, the one he had given her, rang with an unknown number. It wasn't him. "Louise, it's David Chen from the conservatory." David, the first cellist in the student orchestra, a kind, talented musician she had considered a friend. "David," she breathed, a wave of both relief and panic washing over her. How did you get this number?" "It wasn't easy," he laughed. "We were all worried. You just vanished. Is everything okay?" I'm fine," she lied. "Just dealing with some family matters." "I'm sorry to hear that. Listen, I'm calling because the Argent City Virtuosi Orchestra is holding a special competition. The winner gets a solo with the symphony next season. The entry deadline is tomorrow. Louise, you have to do it. This is your shot. A solo with the symphony, the dream. For one dizzying moment she saw it, the stage, the lights, the freedom. I don't know, David," she stammered, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. "Don't give me I don't know," he insisted. "You're the best. Just think about it, okay?" After she hung up, Louise paced the apartment like a caged animal. The dream now felt tantalizingly close. A rebellion, a way to reclaim her identity. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a fever of indecision. He would forbid it, of course. A public performance would draw attention. It would give her a foothold in a world outside of him. He would never allow it. But the seed of defiance had been planted. When Marco arrived that evening, he knew instantly that something had changed. "You're upset," he stated. "I want to enter a competition," she said, the words rushing out. "A solo with the Argent City Symphony." His face remained a mask of calm, but she saw a cold, hard glint in his eyes. "No." The single word was a steel door slamming shut. "You can't do that," she protested, her voice rising. "You can't control every part of my life. This is my music. It's the one thing you don't own." "Everything in this room belongs to me," he said, his voice dangerously soft as he walked toward her. "The roof over your head, the clothes on your back, the violin you play, and your music," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, "has been mine since the first moment I heard it. You will not perform on a stage for the gratification of 1,000 strangers. When you play for an audience of one." "I hate you," she whispered, the words torn from her, tears of pure, impotent rage burning in her eyes. "You're a monster." "I am," he agreed, his voice a silken murmur. He reached out, not to strike her, but to cup her face. His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped. The gesture was so gentle, so tender. It was a profound violation. But even monsters have their treasures, and they do not share. Something inside Louise snapped. Months of suppressed fear, of silent rage, of suffocating control, all of it erupted. She shoved him in the chest with all her strength. "Stay away from me." He didn't move. He was a mountain of granite. He simply absorbed the impact, his hand still cupping her face. And then, his other hand shot out and seized her wrist, the grip like iron. "Do not," he said, his voice losing all softness, now pure, cold steel. "Ever push me away again." The force in his voice, in his grip, terrified her. But her defiance, once unleashed, would not be contained. She struggled against his hold, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "Let me go." "Never," he snarled. And then he hauled her against him. His arm snaked around her waist, pulling her flush against his hard body. Her struggles were useless, mere spasms against an implacable force. He lowered his head, his dark eyes burning into hers, and she knew, with a fatalistic certainty, that the moment that had been hovering between them for weeks was about to be fulfilled. He didn't kiss her. What he did was more devastating. He simply held her there, his face inches from hers, forcing her to look at him, to breathe the same air, to feel the unshakable power in his arms. Her world shrank to the single breath of space between their lips. The tension was a physical act in itself, a possession so absolute that a kiss would have been a relief. Her lips parted in a silent protest, but no sound came out. Her mind was screaming, but her body, caught in the magnetic field of his presence, betrayed her will. The tremor that went through her was no longer from rage, but from a terrifying realization. The fight was already over. He watched her break. He saw the flame of defiance in her eyes flicker and die, replaced by a bleak despair. Only then, when her surrender was total and silent, did he ease his grip. His hand released her wrist and moved up to tangle in her hair, not with violence, but with a definitive possessiveness, tilting her head back. He didn't need to take. She had already been taken. The act was already consummated in the silence between them. He was the monster. He was her captor. He was her cage. And in that moment, as he studied her, consuming her with his gaze alone, she knew she was utterly and irrevocably lost. The confrontation ended as abruptly as it began. Marco pulled back, his breathing heavy in the quiet room. He didn't release her entirely, but his hands moved to her shoulders, holding her a small distance away. Louise's eyes were wide, her body trembling with a chaotic storm of emotions, terror, rage, and a dizzying awareness of her fascination with that power. She felt branded, claimed in a way more permanent than any gift or threat. He stared at her, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that stripped her bare. She saw no triumph in his expression. She saw something far more terrifying, a raw, unguarded hunger, a possessiveness so profound it was part of his soul. He hadn't just asserted his control. He had revealed the depth of his obsession. "There will be no more talk of competitions," he said, his voice a low, rough growl that vibrated through his hands into her shoulders. "There will be no more talk of a life outside these walls. Your world is here. Your stage is this room. Your audience is me. Do you understand?" Louise couldn't find her voice. She could only stare at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The fight had gone out of her, consumed by the overwhelming intensity of that moment. In its place was a cold, terrifying clarity. She had fought, and she had lost. She had tried to hold on to one small piece of her old self, and he had ripped it from her hands and consumed it with his will alone. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the only answer she had left. The corner of his mouth twitched, a glimmer of something that wasn't quite a smile. It was the look of a king who has finally quelled a rebellion. He released her, and the sudden absence of his touch left her feeling cold and strangely adrift. She took a staggering step back, wrapping her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold her fractured self together. He turned and walked to the bar, pouring himself a whiskey with a steady hand. The absolute control he possessed was monstrous. He had just shattered her world, and he moved as if he had done nothing more than close a business deal. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice returning to its familiar, cool command. "We will be leaving the city for a while. I have a house in the country. It is quiet there. You will bring the violin. Nothing else will be necessary." He was taking her away, cutting her last, tenuous connection to the city, to the hospital where her father was, to the world she had known. He was taking her to a new cage, a more isolated one, where the only person she would see, the only voice she would hear, would be his. Louise didn't protest. What was the point? She had been a resident of Argent City. Now her world had shrunk to the size of a single man. His will was the only geography that mattered. The next morning, the black sedan was waiting in the garage. Shadow, the cat, had been taken by one of Marco's silent men to be cared for in their absence. Another comfort, another piece of her new life, removed by his decree. She carried the Amati's case. Marco was waiting for her in the back of the car. The drive was long and silent. They left the glittering spires of Argent City behind. They drove for hours, into a landscape of rolling hills and dense ancient forests. The autumn trees were a riot of gold and crimson, a beautiful dying world. The house was not a house. It was a fortress of dark stone and smoked glass, built into the side of a mountain, overlooking a vast, misty lake. It was utterly isolated, beautiful, severe, and completely inescapable. "This was my father's house," Marco said, his voice low in the immense quiet. "He built it to be a refuge, a place where the noise of the world could not reach." He led her inside. The interior was much like his penthouse: dark wood, leather, stone, and enormous windows that framed the wild, lonely landscape. It was the home of a man at war with the world. He showed her to a room. It was beautiful, light, with a bed bigger than her entire old apartment, and a private balcony that overlooked the lake. The view was breathtakingly beautiful, achingly lonely. That night, he didn't ask her to play. They ate dinner in a grand dining hall, seated at opposite ends of a long, polished table, the silence between them as vast and deep as the lake outside. Louise barely touched the exquisite food. She watched him, this man who now owned her life, and saw not a monster, but a man wrapped in a solitude of his own making, a prison far older and deeper than the one he had built for her. After dinner, he stood by the massive fireplace, the flickering light dancing over the hard lines of his face. He looked at her, and his eyes held a familiar, unnerving intensity. "Come here," he said. It was not a request. Her body obeyed before her mind could protest. She walked toward him, her steps silent on the thick rug, until she stood before him in the warm glow of the fire. He reached out and gently took her hand. His thumb stroked the delicate skin of her wrist, right over the frantic pulse he must have felt. "You are afraid of me," he stated softly. "Yes," she whispered, the truth a stark, naked admission in the silent room. "Good," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Fear is a beginning. It is a form of respect." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, an almost futile gesture. "You have a beautiful, savage soul, Louise Sawyer, and I have all the time in the world to understand it." He released her hand and turned back to the fire. Louise stood frozen for a moment, the ghost of his lips burning on her skin. She looked at his back, a solid wall of power, and then at the beautiful, silent room. This was her life now, a prisoner in a palace, a treasure for a lonely king. The rage was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching resignation. He had taken everything from her, but he had given her one thing in return: a terrible, certain future. She would wake up tomorrow in his house. She would play his violin for him. And she would live every moment of the rest of her life as the beautiful, cherished, and utterly captive possession of Marco Bellini. The golden cage was locked, and the key had been thrown into the silent, deep waters of the lake. The weeks bled into a month. Autumn gave way to the skeletal grays of early winter. The lake house became Louise's entire world, a silent, beautiful prison. The routine Marco had established became the rhythm of her life: quiet mornings, afternoons with the amati, and tense, charged evenings in his presence. The kiss had changed everything. The physical barrier between them had been broken. Now, when he watched her play, it was with an undisguised hunger. The line between patron and possessor, between captor and something else, had blurred into a terrifying, unreadable fog. Louise felt her own defiance calcify into a strange, passive acceptance. This was her life. The fight was over. One night, a fierce wind howled outside. Louise had just finished a somber Sadi piece. Marco was in his usual armchair by the fire, his eyes closed as he listened. For a moment, in the flickering firelight, he looked almost peaceful. The illusion was shattered by the sound of an engine. Marco's eyes snapped open instantly, the piece replaced by a diamond-hard alertness. He rose in a single fluid motion. Moments later, the heavy front door opened. A man entered, broad and solid, with a grizzled beard and the weary, watchful eyes of a lifelong soldier. "Leo," Marco said. "We have a problem in the city, Marco," the man replied. He glanced at Louise, his expression unreadable, before his focus returned entirely to his boss. "It's the Bratva. Sokolov is making a move." At the name Sokolov, a change came over Marco. It was subtle, But to Louise, who had spent a month studying his every micro-expression, it was a tectonic shift. The air around him grew colder, the control in his posture tightening into something lethal. "What kind of move?" Marco asked. "He hit our warehouse on the docks, took the entire shipment, left 3 of our men dead. He sent a message," Leo said. Marco walked to the window, staring out into the dark, stormy night. Sokolov is a rabid dog, not a chess player. A frontal assault is not his style. This is an escalation. Why now? Leo hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze again flicking to Louise. The glance was all it took. The unspoken answer filled the room, cold and suffocating. Me. She was the reason. Her existence, this secret treasure he had hidden away, had been discovered. She was the weakness his enemy had found. Marco's stillness was absolute. He didn't turn from the window, but Louise saw his reflection in the dark glass, his face a mask of pure, cold fury. "He knows," Marco stated. "We think so," Leo confirmed. "There's been talk. Whispers of a new interest. He's testing your focus." Louise felt a tremor start in her hand. She was no longer just a prisoner in a personal, psychological war. She was a pawn in a real one, a war fought with bullets and bodies. The cage she had resented now felt, for the first time, like a form of protection. Marco turned from the window, his eyes meeting hers. The predatory hunger was still there, but now it was overlaid with something else, a grim, protective resolve. "They will come here," he said to Leo. "He'll want to take her from me." "My men are positioned on the perimeter," Leo said. "But the estate is large, and this storm gives them cover." "It's a target," Marco agreed. He looked back at Louise, his gaze pinning her in place. His tone was not that of a captor to his prize, but of a commander to a soldier. "Go to your room. Pack a small bag. Only the essentials. Be ready to move in 5 minutes." The command was so sharp, so urgent, she obeyed without thinking. In her room, her hands shook as she threw a few sweaters into a small leather duffel. Her gaze fell on the Amati case. She grabbed it. When she returned, Marco was shrugging into a heavy, dark overcoat. He glanced at her, then at the violin case, and gave a single, approving nod. "Leo will take you out the back way," Marco told her. "There's a car waiting. He'll take you to a safe location. You will do exactly as he says. Understood?" "What about you?" she asked. A cold, grim smile touched his lips. "I'm staying," he said. "Viktor Sokolov sent me a message. I'm going to deliver my reply in person." He moved toward her. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, the touch surprisingly steady. His dark eyes bored into hers, and in their depths, she saw a promise. "They will not touch you," he murmured, a vow made with the absolute certainty of a god. "I will burn their entire world to ash before I let them lay a hand on what is mine." And with that, he turned to Leo. "Go, now." Marco's command broke Louise's paralysis. Leo took her by the arm, his grip firm. "This way, Ms. Sawyer, quick and quiet." He pulled her down a narrow corridor to the kitchen. Another man, younger and hard-faced, waited by the back door, a compact submachine gun in his hands. "They're moving, boss," the young man whispered. Motion sensors tripped on the north ridge. "How many?" Leo asked. "At least a dozen." Leo pulled the door open, and a blast of icy wind and rain hit her. They ran. Louise clutched the violin case to her chest. The wet, slick grass tried to trip her with every step. Leo was a rock beside her, his powerful body shielding her from the wind. Within minutes, they reached the edge of the woods and a narrow, muddy service road. A heavy, black SUV, its engine running, waited in the shadows. "Get her in the back," Leo commanded, pushing Louise toward the open rear door. "Nico, you're with me. Marco needs us." Louise was bundled into the back of the SUV. The young soldier, Nico, got in beside her. The doors slammed shut, plunging her into an isolated, terrifying silence. Through the window, she saw Leo and the other man disappear back into the trees, back toward the main house where Marco remained. They were going back to the fight. For him. The SUV lurched forward, its powerful tires churning through the mud. The driver didn't turn on the headlights, navigating the treacherous road with an unnerving skill, using the intermittent flashes of lightning to guide them. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," Nico replied, not looking at her. Suddenly, The world exploded in a shower of sparks, and the deafening shriek of metal on metal. The SUV swerved violently, throwing Louise hard against the door. Nico instinctively threw his arm out, bracing her. A second vehicle, a huge, dark truck, had rammed them from the side, forcing them off the road. "They're here!" the driver yelled. "Out! Go! Into the woods!" Before Louise could process, Nico had the door open and was pulling her out into the storm. "Run!" he shouted. The doors of the truck behind them slammed open, and large dark figures piled out. The crack of a gunshot split the air. The driver who had just exited the SUV crumpled to the ground without a sound. Terror, pure and undiluted, propelled Louise forward. She ran blindly into the tangle of the forest. Nico was right behind her, turning to fire a controlled burst from his weapon. She could hear shouting behind them, in a language she didn't understand, Russian. Another burst of gunfire erupted behind them, closer this time. Nico grunted. He stumbled. "Keep moving," he gasped. But she saw him clutch his side, and in the next flash of lightning, she saw the dark stain spreading across his jacket. They burst into a small clearing, and her blood ran cold. 2 more men were waiting for them. They were cut off. One of the men was huge, a mountain of muscle with a thick beard and dead gray eyes. He held a pistol, pointing it not at Nico but directly at Louise. Nico moved in front of her, shielding her with his body. "You will die before you touch her," he snarled. The large man grinned, and from the trees behind them, a new voice emerged, calm and laced with a cold, chilling amusement. What a noble sentiment, boy, but a very foolish one. A man stepped into the clearing. He was tall and lean, dressed in an expensive, perfectly tailored black coat. His hair was blonde, almost white, and his face was handsome in a sharp, cruel way. His pale blue eyes landed on Louise, and they lit up with a look of triumphant, predatory glee. "So," Viktor Sokolov said, his English perfect, "the little bird has left her cage. Bellini has grown sentimental in his old age. He should have known. I always did enjoy breaking his toys." The name, Viktor Sokolov, hung in the stormy air, an omen of disaster. This was the man Marco had called a rabid dog. But looking at him, Louise saw no madness in his pale blue eyes. She saw only cold, intelligent cruelty. He was a different kind of predator than Marco. Where Marco was a creature of shadow and obsessive control, Sokolov was a wolf who reveled in the chaos of the hunt and the terror of his prey. "Finish the guard," Sokolov said with a dismissive wave, his eyes locked on Louise. The large man with the dead eyes raised his pistol. Nico, wounded and outmatched, didn't hesitate. He fired a burst, one last desperate act of defiance. The large man staggered but didn't fall. Another of Sokolov's men, moving with brutal efficiency, fired from the side. The impact threw Nico backward. His eyes, wide with shock, met Louise's for one terrible moment before the light went out of them. He had died for her. A man whose name she barely knew had given his life to protect Marco Bellini's property. The thought was a shard of ice in her soul. Louise screamed. Sokolov clicked his tongue. Such drama. He took a step toward her. Louise scrambled back, her feet slipping in the mud, clutching the violin case like a shield. "Don't touch me!" she spat, her voice trembling but filled with a venom she didn't know she possessed. Sokolov laughed, a genuinely amused sound that was more terrifying than any threat. Feisty. I can see the appeal. But you misunderstand, little bird. You are leverage. A beautiful, fragile key to unlock Bellini's empire. His gaze raked over her, clinical and insulting. But I admit, I am curious what a 300-year-old violin sounds like when it is smashed against a tree. The threat was so cruel it stole her breath. He was threatening not just her life, but her soul. "You will not lay a finger on her, Viktor." The voice came from the darkness behind Sokolov's men. It was low, calm, and carried an authority that cut through the howl of the wind. "Marco." Sokolov's men spun, raising their weapons. Too late. From the shadows, gunshots echoed. 2 of Sokolov's men fell before they even knew where the shots came from. Marco stepped into the clearing. He was not alone. Leo and 2 other men, all in dark tactical gear, materialized from the trees. Marco himself held a pistol with a calm ease that spoke of a lifetime of familiarity. Sokolov smiled, his pale eyes glittering. Marco, so good of you to join us. My men die for a cause, Victor, Marco replied, his voice a low, deadly counterpoint to Sokolov's mocking tone. Yours die for your ego. Let her go. This is between us. But she is what is between us, Sokolov retorted, his amusement growing. He moved sideways, positioning himself closer to Louise, his hand reaching out to grab her arm. This is the new piece on the board. Take your hand off her, Marco said. The words weren't shouted. They were spoken with a quiet, absolute finality, a promise of annihilation. Louise saw the calculation in Sokolov's eyes. He had what he wanted. He had Marco in the open. His focus narrowed. Sokolov's hand shot out, not for Louise's arm, but for the violin case. He wrenched it from her grasp. No! Louise cried out. I think I will take a souvenir from this evening, Sokolov said with a grin, backing toward the cover of the trees. He had won. He had the ultimate hostage, the one thing he knew Marco valued. But as Sokolov retreated, Marco's own cold smile returned. You were always a fool, Victor. You think you know what I value. Then Marco did something Louise could never have predicted. He raised his pistol, his aim steady, his eyes looking not at Sokolov, but directly at her. Forgive me, Mia Cara, he whispered. And he fired. The shot wasn't for Sokolov. It wasn't for his men. It was for the Amity case in Sokolov's hand. The bullet struck the case with a sickening crack of splintering wood and metal, ripping it from Sokolov's grasp and sending it spinning into the mud. For a second, everyone froze. The audacity of the act was incomprehensible. Marco had just shot the hostage. He had damaged the priceless treasure to prove it was not the prize. Sokolov stared at the ruined case, then back at Marco, his face a mask of disbelief. In that moment of hesitation, he finally understood. The violin was just a thing. The real treasure, the one Marco would burn the world for, was the woman standing beside him. And in that moment of distraction, Leo and Marco's men opened fire. The clearing exploded in a deafening roar. Marco ignored the firefight. His entire focus was on Louise. As bullets tore through the air, he moved, closing the distance between them. He grabbed her, pulling her behind a fallen log, shielding her body with his own as the battle raged. He pushed her head down, his hand firm on the back of her neck, his body a solid, warm wall against the chaos. The firefight was brutal and short. The shouting and gunshots subsided, replaced by the howl of the wind. Finally, silence. Is it clear? Marco called out. It's clear, Marco. Leo's voice came back. Sokolov got away, but he left most of his men behind. Marco finally stood. He looked down at her, his face grim, a smear of mud on his cheek. He looked feral, dangerous, and more alive than she had ever seen him. He held out a hand. Get up. She took his hand, and he pulled her to her feet. She was covered in mud, her body shaking uncontrollably. Her gaze fell on the scene of carnage, the still forms on the ground, and a wave of nausea hit her. Then she saw it, the ruined violin case. She walked to it as if in a trance and knelt in the mud, unlatching it with trembling fingers. The violin was shattered, the neck broken, the body fractured. 300 years of history, of music, of beauty, destroyed. A sob tore from her throat. It was just wood and string, Marco's voice said from behind her. I can buy you 100 more. She looked up at him, her face streaked with rain and tears. It wasn't just wood and string, she whispered, her voice broken. It was a voice, and you killed it. He stared down at her, his dark eyes holding a strange, almost pained light. Yes, he said, his voice a low, hoarse murmur. I did, to prove to him, and to you, that there is only one voice in this world I will not allow to be silenced. He reached down, his hands strong and sure, and lifted her from the mud into his arms. She was too shocked and cold to resist. He held her against his chest, her face pressed into his shoulder, and for the first time, his embrace was not about possession. It was about protection, fierce, desperate, and terrifying. And as the cold rain continued to fall, Louise Sawyer began to weep, not just for the death of a violin, but for the death of the woman she had once been. The ride back to the city was a silent blur. They didn't return to the lake house. Another black SUV had materialized from the darkness, and Marco had simply placed her inside. They went directly to his penthouse. The elevator ascended, back into the heart of the glittering, oblivious city. When the doors opened, the air was charged with the memory of the violent night. Marco poured 2 brandies. He pressed one into her cold, trembling hands. "Drink." She obeyed, the fiery liquid a welcome shock. He watched her, his expression grim. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said. He went to his bedroom and returned with a heavy, dark cashmere robe, his robe. "There's a bathroom through there. Take a hot shower." In the bathroom, Louise stripped off her mud-caked clothes. She stood under the scalding water, trying to wash away the feeling of the forest, the scent of fear, but it was a stain that went deeper than skin. When she emerged, wrapped in the heavy robe that smelled of him, Marco was standing by the great glass window, looking out at the city lights. The fireplace was lit, casting a warm glow on the room. He turned as she entered, his eyes taking in the sight of her, small and pale, swallowed by the dark fabric of his robe. He gestured to the leather armchair closest to the fire. "Sit." She curled into the chair. He remained standing, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Why?" she finally whispered. "Why destroy it?" He turned his head, his profile sharp against the city. "Because its value was Sokolov's leverage. He thinks everything has a price. I had to teach him that some things are beyond price. That some things, if you try to take them from me, I will destroy myself before I let you have them." "I will destroy myself." The word sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't talking about the violin. He was talking about her. "That's not protection," she said, her voice trembling. "That's madness." "It is the only kind of protection that matters in my world," he countered, turning to face her. "It is the promise of total annihilation. It is the only thing men like Sokolov understand." He knelt before her chair, a shocking gesture from a man who commanded empires. "I did not choose the world I was born into," he said, his voice a low, raw confession. "I was born a king's son, and when he died, I was handed his bloody crown. And then I saw you. In a world of lies and violence, I saw something pure, your music. It was the only honest thing I had heard in 30 years. His thumb stroked her cheek. "I did the only thing a man like me knows how to do. I took you. I put you in a cage to keep your fire from being extinguished by the ugliness of the world, to keep it for myself." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "What you call madness, Louise, is the only way I know how to love." Love. The word was a detonation in the silent room. He had never used it. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of confusion and fear, and a terrible, aching sorrow for them both. He was a monster, yes, but he was a monster who had just bled for her, who had destroyed a part of himself to keep her safe, who was now kneeling before her, confessing a truth as dark as his soul. He cupped her face in his hands, as if she were the most fragile, precious thing in the world, and he kissed her. This kiss was not a punishment. It was not a claim. It was a plea, desperate, hungry, and filled with a pain that mirrored her own. And as his lips moved against hers, gentle and searching, Louise, for the first time, didn't just surrender. Some small, broken part of her, a part she thought had long been dead, leaned into the kiss, and hesitantly kissed him back. Her response, hesitant as it was like a spark to a powder keg. A low, guttural groan rumbled in Marco's chest, a sound of profound, desperate relief. The kiss deepened, the gentleness giving way to a raw, aching passion that had been held in check for months. One of his hands slid to the nape of her neck, fingers tangling in her damp hair. The other wrapped around her waist, pulling her from the chair onto her knees before him on the plush rug. In that moment, they were equals, 2 figures kneeling before the fire. Louise's hands came up to his shoulders, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos and sensation. The terror of the night, the violence, the confession, it had all stripped them down to their most essential selves. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, their breathing ragged in the silent room. In the firelight, she saw a vulnerability in his eyes she had never thought possible. The iron mask of the dawn was gone, and in its place was a man who looked at her as if she held the power to either save him or destroy him completely. "Louise," he whispered, his voice hoarse with an emotion she couldn't name. He stood, pulling her effortlessly with him. He didn't carry her. Instead, he took her hand and led her to the great glass window. The city glittered below them, a silent universe of lights. He stood behind her, not touching her, but his proximity was a palpable warmth at her back. She saw their reflection in the dark glass, her small, pale figure, and his tall, imposing shadow enveloping her. "Look," he said, his voice a murmur near her ear. "They all live in cages they cannot see. Cages of debt, of ambition, of fear. Yours, at least, is an honest one." It was not a comfort. It was a terrible truth. In that moment, looking at their reflection, she did not see a captor and a prisoner. She saw two lonely souls, trapped together against the world. Her surrender wasn't an act of passion in a bedroom, but a quiet, chilling acceptance right there, before the skyline. She didn't need to undress. Her soul was already bare to him. He finally placed his hands on her shoulders, a gesture of definitive, yet non-sexual ownership. It was a king's claim on his most precious domain, and Louise, too exhausted to fight, simply leaned back, resting her head against his chest, closing her eyes to the city outside. In the darkness of the penthouse they found a kind of violent, somber peace, a sanctuary built on the ruins of who they used to be. 6 months later, the sound of a violin once again filled the penthouse. It was a new instrument, a guarneri, but the music was different. There was still a deep sorrow in the notes, but it was now threaded through with a powerful, soaring passion, the music of a soul that had seen the abyss and survived. Louise Sawyer lowered her bow. Marco was there, as he always was, listening with an attention that was a form of worship. Their life had found a new rhythm. The cage was still a cage, but the doors were unlocked. She had nowhere to go because she didn't want to go. The fear had been replaced by a complex, dangerous intimacy. He rose and came to her, taking her hands. "The symphony is holding auditions," he said. "David Chen called. The old dream, a test." She looked into his dark eyes. She thought of the stage, the applause, the freedom. Then she thought of the cold clearing in the forest, of the terrifying absolute certainty of his protection, of the broken man who had confessed his twisted love. Slowly she shook her head. "No, my audience is here." A wave of profound relief washed over his face. He lifted her hand to his lips. "I know," he whispered. She looked at the man who had destroyed her, and had, somehow, also freed her from her old illusions. He was her captor, her protector, her patron. He was the reflection of everything she feared, and everything she had once mistaken for love. And she, Louise Sawyer, was the only one who could play the music of his soul. The golden cage remained locked, but inside it, the music still lived.